We are so grateful to be joined by our colleagues at the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, Christina McLean and Claire Stanhope, who've prepared this material for us today. So thank you so much to both of you for your work and for being a resource for DFSS and our delegate agencies. So goal for today's training is to learn about disability and access laws and responsibilities for all city-funded delegates. We will also talk specifically about reporting requirements to DFSS that will go in line with these regulations. A question that we have heard and that some of you may have today is, does this apply to my program? The answer is yes. We've asked all of our DFSS delegate agencies to attend this training, regardless of which program model you operate, because all city delegate agencies are responsible for ensuring access to services for people with disabilities. So you will see that we'll cover some guidance that's specific to homeless shelters, but the overall sort of regulations and reporting requirements will actually apply across all DFSS funded programs. A couple quick housekeeping items. Please stay on mute throughout the presentation, just given how many folks we have on the call. As you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We will hold time at the end for those questions or try to address any sort of quick ones in the chat. And then for any questions we don't have time to get to today or that we need to look into further, we'll plan to share out responses in writing following this training. Lastly, training today will be recorded. We will send out the recording, the slides, and some accompanying resources following these trainings. As you know, we've also asked each agency to identify a designated contact person for Section 504 at your agencies. So for questions moving forward, that person will be sort of your main point of contact within your organization. But with that, I will pass over to Claire.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Stanhope, and I am the training officer at the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. I'll be presenting a little bit later in the slides, but I'm going to pass it over to Christina McLean to kick us off.
Thanks, Claire. I'm Christina McLean. I'm a Deputy Commissioner here at MLPD. Excited to have this opportunity to share with you today disability and access in regards to individuals with people with disabilities as they may be accessing your services at homeless shelters. So with that, we can go to the next slide. I'll get right into our first topic here today, and that is, we can go back to the agenda. We'll get started by talking about giving a quick access check. If you need any accessibility for any reason, please reach out to Claire in the chat, and we can make adjustments to make sure that you are getting the information as you need it. We're going to define disability, talk about some laws and regulations that have to do with providing services to people with disabilities in relationship to homeless shelters, and talk about your responsibilities as well, and then provide some resources for you. So as we get started, we will start by defining disability to give a little background. Next slide.
And Christina, just to chime in really quickly, I'm seeing some notes in the chat that it would help if you could speak up a little bit or maybe move closer to your mic. Folks are having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Okay. Let me know if this is better.
That's better for me. So we'll let folks chime in if it's not better for them.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I haven't said anything important yet. So we will move into defining disability. So next slide, please.
I did just want to let Christina know too, like I'm trying to control the slides, but it's not letting me through the remote control, so you may have to control them throughout the.
Okay. So according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed in 1990, disability can be defined in 3 different ways. The first way is an individual who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. In our next slide here, we will talk about some examples of a mental or physical impairment. And those things can be impairments such as cognitive, psychological, cardiovascular, different things that impact various areas of your body. Can we move to the next slide, please? There we go. And then on the second half of this slide, it talks about should I keep going?
Yeah, the slides went away just 1 second. I'm not sure.
Okay. We can talk about a major life activity. And this is pretty broad, as you will see from the definition, that a major life activity can be something that impacts how you eat, how you breathe, how you sleep, movements like walking, sitting, standing, lifting, cognitive functions like communicating, different sensory functions like seeing or hearing, and then some ways that your body may function in terms of your digestive system, and how your different organs function. So it is very broad, but this is just one part of the definition. In our next slide, we talk about the second part of the definition, which is an individual is considered having a disability if they have a record of a physical or mental impairment. So in our next slide, we will give you some examples of this can be someone who had cancer but is now in remission. The history of that diagnosis would cover them under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A lot of people don't know that. But if you have a diagnosed mental health condition, the history of that diagnosis as well would protect you under the ADA, as well as your history of like taking time off work to deal with a medical condition. You'd also be covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act for that as well. In the next slide, we will talk about the third part of the definition, which is someone who is perceived as having a disability. So this is just another example of how broad this definition is. So in the next slide, it'll talk about how this can be something as such as like a burn or scar on your face. An individual may think that you have a disability because of that visible scar, but it might not impact any of their major life activities. So therefore, just being perceived as having a disability provides you protection under the ADA. And then it's just important to remember that some disabilities are invisible. So that means that, to ensure that you're not discriminating against someone who you think may have a disability. So this is just a recap. So a disability could be defined as someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or major life activity, has a history of that impairment, or is perceived as having a disability. You can fall under just one of these categories to be considered having a disability. And homeless shelters are expected under the law to serve individuals with disabilities and have services that can be made accessible for individuals with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities are very common or very prevalent in the homeless population. So 50% of individuals who are considered homeless are also considered having a disability. And this is 2 to 2.5 times more likely than a general population. So it is a rather high number, and this is just because of the high unemployment rate of people with disabilities, as well as the barriers to finding accessible and affordable housing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Claire.
Great, this is Claire speaking. So now we're going to talk about how disability is intertwined into different laws and your responsibilities as delegate agencies. So first, we are going to talk about federal laws. So both the Department of Family and Support Services, or DFSS, and delegate agencies are required to comply with federal law. There are three that we're going to talk about today. The first is the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. The second will be the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or ADA. And the third will be the Fair Housing Act. In addition to federal laws, there are also state and local laws that need to be followed. So the Chicago Fair Housing Ordinance, as well as the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance, the Cook County Human Rights Ordinance, and the Environmental Barriers Act. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination specifically based on disabilities in programs and services that receive federal funding. And so this also includes shelters who are receiving financial assistance from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as well as other programming and homeless services that are receiving federal funding. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, as it's more commonly known, has 5 different titles. The first title is employment. The second title is local and state government, and that is the title that makes sure that state and local governments provide services, programs, and activities that are accessible to individuals with disabilities. Under this, any delegate agency receiving funding from government, and that's any level of government, and carrying out public functions on behalf of a public entity, that's the government, would fall under Title II of this ADA. So this would include all delegate agencies contracted with the city of Chicago. So that's going to be a really important title to be familiar with. And then Title III is public accommodations. And Title III of the ADA also might apply to delegate agencies. So it's also good to be familiar with public accommodations, which covers any facilities or programming that the public has access to. The Fair Housing Act and Chicago Fair Housing Ordinance both prohibits housing discrimination on the basis of protected classes, including disability. So this requires owners of housing facilities, which includes homeless shelters, to make reasonable exceptions to policies and operations to make sure that people with disabilities have equal housing opportunities. So that is the Fair Housing Act, but it's also solidified by the Chicago Fair Housing Ordinance, which also prohibits discrimination in housing based on disability. Now moving into our local ordinance a little more specifically, the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance again prohibits discrimination based on protected classes, including disability, and specifically it prohibits discrimination in public accommodations. So that's what we were talking about earlier related to Title III. Public accommodations even include private businesses, not-for-profit businesses. It's really just anywhere that serves the public, including private businesses. It also prohibits retaliation for those who use their rights under this ordinance, and it's enforced by the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, or CCHR, which we will provide you with their contact information at the end of this presentation. Lastly, the Environmental Barriers Act. That is an act within the state of Illinois to make sure that people with disabilities have equal access to public facilities and multi-story housing. So it's going to apply to physical accessibility in newly constructed or renovated buildings to make sure that they comply with Illinois Accessibility Code. Okay, so with all of those different laws, these are some of the key requirements for agencies to understand the application of those laws to your services. So we've used this term quite a bit already. Accessibility, what is it? It is the way that your services or your programs, your physical environment, or your products like furniture are made or designed to be usable by everyone, no matter how they encounter it. So if your organization is truly accessible, people with disabilities can equally benefit without telling you about their disability. So they don't have to disclose their disability because it's already accessible to them. So a good example of this is a ramp. So if you think about having stairs to enter your space to receive services, those who can climb and walk upstairs are able to enter your space and receive services. But if you have a ramp, those who are able to walk and climb stairs can still access your services using the ramp, but also so can individuals who use mobility devices like a wheelchair, or individuals additionally may benefit, not just those with disabilities. So somebody maybe who's walking and has a wheeled suitcase, for example, also benefits from that resource. So that's really what accessibility is about. It's important because it is the law at federal, state, and local level, which we've discussed, but more importantly, it benefits everybody. So in that example of the ramp, the person who has a wheeled suitcase is still benefiting from that accessibility feature. So in terms of key requirements, we're going to go through 4 today. And the first we're going to start off with is accessible facilities, so your built environment and space. So it's important for you to maintain an inventory of shelter specific, or if you are other homeless services, your facility specific accessible features. So that could include entrances or exits where individuals are able to use a ramp or a platform lift to enter. So if somebody with a disability comes to receive your services, you're able to tell them where they can enter. And because Chicago is an older city, sometimes we need to be aware that that entrance may not be the front entrance. In terms of bathrooms, knowing where there are accessible bathrooms where individuals are able to transfer on and off of a mobility device, or maybe there are bars on the side that can help people transfer. So knowing where there are bathrooms with some of those features. And in terms of those who are having shelters, beds or cots need to be accessible as well. So an accessible bed or cot, those are 17 to 19 inches off the ground, which is a little bit nitty gritty. But the basic thing is that it helps individuals who are using wheelchairs to be able to transfer from their wheelchair into the bed with space to transfer. Also, accessible cots often have side rails as safety features or adjustable headrests. So they do have a little bit more in terms of safety for the individual with a disability. So those, just knowing what resources you have available if a request is to come in is really valuable. The second is to have policies and emergency plans in place for people with disabilities prior to an emergency. So thinking through your current emergency plan and thinking through if you have a policy for what to do, for example, for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, to be alerted to a fire alarm that does not have a flashing light included on it. Or for somebody who uses a mobility device in the event of a fire in the middle of the night. So making sure that you're including people with disabilities into your emergency planning. And lastly, if your shelter cannot meet the accessible needs of a person with a disability, make sure to contact the Centralized Shelter Intake, Transportation, and Crisis Response at 312-746-7213 or 14 or 15. Okay, so that's the physical space, which is a huge part of accessibility. But the second part of accessibility is related to effective communication and serving individuals. So your staff are expected to make your processes accessible for people with disabilities, and oftentimes that comes through knowing about how to effectively communicate with people with different types of disabilities. So for example, you could be asked to read aloud on an intake form for individuals who are blind or low vision, or you may be asked for an interpreter or to write back and forth. So you don't always have to have an interpreter. You could write back and forth or use your device during the intake process for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. And now I'm going to pass it over to Christine McLean to talk about best practices for assisting people with disabilities.
Thanks, Claire. So in terms of best practices, there's a couple different things that you need to be aware of. The first one would be to, if you think that someone has a disability, first ask if they need assistance. It's really important that you not assume that someone needs help. and just asking if they need help um, is the first step. If the individual says no, then you just let them go. But if they do say yes, the follow-up question would be, how can I assist you? Um, Everybody needs help in a different way, so just getting a better understanding of how they would like to be supported is best practice. And then we just like to make sure that there's a reminder to not touch anyone's mobility device without permission. We will go over some best practices for effective communication for individuals who have a physical or mobility disability. So, if an individual has a physical or mobility disability, this typically means that they have a hard time moving, and that could be sitting, standing, walking. So, in this case, a lot of individuals may have a mobility device. And then really important to make sure that those mobility devices stay close to the individual with a disability, whether it be by their bed in most cases. Just in case they do have to get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom, or if they need it to just move around, it's important that it's near them so they can move around without getting hurt. Again, making sure that you ask someone if they need help before touching those devices. And this is the same for someone who may be blind or low vision. Having a white cane or a walker or a wheelchair, those things are considered a part of an individual's personal space. So not touching them without permission is really important. The next disability that we'll talk a little bit about are individuals who have sensory disabilities. So sensory disabilities can be considered ones that impact how you hear, see, or your spatial awareness. So for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, it's important to take their lead in how they wish to communicate. People who are deaf or hard of hearing have a variety of ways that they communicate, and you have a lot of tools at your disposal to start that communication or follow that communication. So it could be writing notes to each other on pen and paper, or typing out notes on your phone back and forth. Um, some individuals can read lips, so that could be a potential way to communicate as well. Um, Ensuring that your face isn't covered or you don't have any type of mask on when you're communicating with someone who's deaf or hard of hearing is really important. They may be reading your lips or really gauging your facial expressions to get more context of the conversation. So it's important to just be aware of that in those situations. For individuals who are blind or low vision, providing some verbal directions is always really helpful, or giving a quick orientation to the space. Individuals who are blind or low vision are kind of used to navigating new spaces. So if you are walking them around, you can offer them your elbow and say, like, okay, if you're looking to go to the bathroom, we can walk straight down this hallway and to the left. It'll be your second door on the left. In those cases, very often individuals are able to find those locations on their own after providing that direction. Um, so that's just something to keep in mind, and is really helpful for individuals. Another situation that may occur is for individuals who are blind or low vision. They might need you to either read the intake form to them or help complete it on their behalf, because those written documents are very often challenging for individuals who are blind or low vision.
This is Claire. So for intellectual or developmental disabilities or mental health conditions, These two obviously are different conditions, but there are some things that overlap in how you can help support some of these individuals. So individuals who have intellectual or developmental disabilities, that is going to be anything that impacts a person's physical learning, language, or behavioral development. And a mental health condition is going to impact a person's ability to regulate, receive, or express emotions, or their behavior and cognition. So in both scenarios, it could be helpful to outline clear expectations ahead of time. So if you have a process for how you provide services, it can be very, very helpful to outline that full process for an individual up front using step-by-step instructions. And as part of that, it can also be very helpful to include pictures or symbols to help explain that process or what to expect. So if you think about bathrooms, if you're in an unfamiliar space, oftentimes bathrooms are easier to find because there's a symbol on the bathroom, so you can easily find where that bathroom is. And similarly, people who are unfamiliar with a process or an experience can really benefit from symbols that helps them if they are not able to read or if English is not their native language to understand something that you're trying to communicate. With those step-by-step instructions, sometimes you'll hear those called social stories, and those can be made to talk to somebody about what that experience may be like. It can help decrease a lot of anxiety because it helps them to know what to expect in scenarios and may help people further benefit from your services. This is by no means a comprehensive de-escalation training, but there are some strategies that you can use if conflict arises due to frustration with an access barrier or maybe something disability related. So the first thing to do is make sure that you're prioritizing both the clients and your own safety. So that's the most important thing first. Do make sure that you're communicating in a calm and respectful tone. And sometimes you do have to pause in between speaking to allow that person to process the information that you're saying. You may need to repeat yourself or rephrase it differently as needed. So if somebody doesn't understand you the first time and you say it a different way, they may understand you better. Make sure not to touch an individual and allow access for an easy exit. So making sure not to block any doorways with your body or hallways so an individual can leave if they need to. And do know when de-escalation is not working and further assistance is needed. Okay, so now we're going to transition into talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications. So the difference between these two is a reasonable accommodation is going to be a change in a rule, a policy, a practice, or a service that allows a person with a disability to have an equal opportunity, versus a modification is a physical change to a space to allow a person with a disability to access and use the premises. So when we were talking about some accessible facilities, that's likely going to be more related to reasonable modifications versus the way that you do things, your communication, your rules and policies, those are going to fall under reasonable accommodations. So some examples of what an accommodation could look like is allowing an individual to use a fridge to store medication because they have diabetes, or reserving a plug for an individual who is deaf and needs to charge their phone because they rely on their phone to type back and forth with individuals for communication, or giving someone the bottom bunk to help with transferring out of their wheelchair and into a bed. So in all three scenarios, those are changes to potential rules or policies, or maybe the services that you provide to allow an individual to manage their disability and related to their disability. In terms of reasonable modifications, that is going to be a physical change. So something like installing grab bars in the bathroom, like we talked about earlier, so individuals can have some help with getting on and off of the toilet, replacing doorknobs with levers because levers require less strength and less motor skills to be able to use than doorknobs do, or rearranging beds so that an individual with a wheelchair can easily navigate their mobility device next to their bed and keeping it close to them. So there is a delegate process for reasonable accommodations, and I will pass this back over to Crispina after this slide so that she can tell you a little bit more about that process. But delegate agencies must follow the process to accommodate the needs of a person with a disability. So the first thing to do is make sure that clients are aware of accommodations, that they are available, that they can make a request. And then when they do make that request, assist them with that request. So there is a reasonable accommodation form, which Crispina will introduce us to shortly and share. And then when that request comes in, fulfilling the request is super important unless there's a significant undue hardship. And we will talk about what an undue hardship looks like. But do keep in mind that if there's an undue hardship, that is not a denial. It's really more of an interactive process. So you could propose or discuss alternatives to meet the client needs rather than tell them, no, we can't fulfill this request for an accommodation. You'll also keep records of those requests and accommodation and provide those to DFSS with the appropriate documentation. And then finally, making sure that you check in with that individual to ensure that the accommodation is meeting the need that they were requesting it for. So now I'll pass it over to Crispina to go further into this process.
Thank you, Claire. So earlier this year, we shared our DFSS policy. The title of the document is DFSS Policies for Delegate Agencies to Ensure Accessibility for Persons with Disabilities in Chicago's Department of Family and Support Services funded shelters. So this policy will now, as Kim mentioned at the beginning of this training, this policy will now apply to all DFSS funded homeless service providers. So please make sure to review this document and implement the guidance that is provided. Previously, our policy applied to 3 program models. So these were shelters, safe havens, and youth transitional housing. The document itself covers meeting the needs of people with disabilities, reasonable accommodation, denials and appeals, documentation and record keeping, key definitions, and the reasonable accommodation form. Most of the information that is in that document we are providing or covering in this training. Please note that there are 2 types of records to complete. One is regarding notifications, meaning that you informed your client at intake that accommodations are available based on disabilities. And the other document would be for accommodation requests, and this would be completing the accommodation request form, which I will be covering. The form asks for the following information. So it's identifying information, the description of the accommodation request, the reason the accommodation is being requested, and how it will help the individual to access the program. In the resolution section, we're asking you to provide the reasoning behind either granting the accommodation, proposing an alternate solution, or denying the request. All of the forms that you complete with requests need to be sent to me and at crispina.ojeda-simmons@cityofchicago.org. And all forms need to be received by the FSS within 24 hours of completion. So as you see here, we're asking for the date the request was made to you, your agency name, your program name, the name of the staff member that completed this form, the name of the individual that requested the accommodation, and then a description of the accommodation itself. And here we're asking you to explain how this accommodation that's being requested is going to help the individual to access the program. And then in the final box, we're asking for an explanation of the resolution. The bottom part is for DFSS to complete, and at the very bottom, you'll see my email address again, requesting for this form to be submitted within 24 hours. This chart that you see here is provided to help guide you in the assessment process. And as you can see, there's specific questions for you to ask, such as, do you have a disability that might make it hard for you to stay in this shelter? Again, shelter it can also be your facility or any other space that the individual needs to access. You don't need to ask these questions verbatim. You can make or use alternate phrasing. Just something to note is that only a fraction of individuals that have a disability identify as having a disability. You can mention, when you think that someone is potentially struggling, you can say, well, I see this. Is this something you need assistance with? Whatever it is that you may see the person potentially struggling with. Another way would be to say to the individual, we have, these are the programs that our agency provides, and they are, if you know there's stairs that they're going to have to climb, if they're going to have to navigate a different space, or move between buildings. These are different things that if you've looked at your space in advance, that individuals are going to need to navigate, where you could describe to them what they're gonna have to go through, and then say, is this something you would need assistance with? Um, if other adjustments could be to schedule. So our breakfast happens at this time, our lunch happens at this time, just things that go by a schedule, or rules, or different aspects of your programming that you can describe to the individual that you think potentially could be barriers for some individual. You could name these out and give the individual an opportunity to say if that would be something that will allow them to access your program, and that will be okay for them or not, and could open a conversation. Um, and then in this next slide, you see this checklist. And so again, it's the similar questions from the chart before. And so these are the questions we're asking you to answer as you're having the conversation with the individual, so that they identify a disability as previously described in this training, and just going down through all the questions to help you decide, is this something that needs to be granted or not. And here, I think we would just encourage you, if in doubt, please reach out with questions, and we're happy to support you as you go about doing this work. If you find that there is a reasonable accommodation that the individual is asking for, but for one reason or another, your agency cannot provide that accommodation, we ask that you reach out to Centralized Shelter Intake, Transportation, and Crisis Response at 312-746-7213, 14, or 15, and get assistance in meeting this accommodation. Again, I would also encourage you to reach out to me if you have questions in relation to, so you can call the number and also reach out to us if you have questions about that. And so now I will pass it back to Claire.
Thanks, this is Claire. Okay, so when we're talking about accommodations and modifications, what would make an undue burden is on a case-by-case basis. And I want to start by saying most things are likely going to be something that is able to be completed, because most accommodations, so 59%, are no cost to the organization. So most accommodation requests do not cost anything. So on a case-by-case basis, the determination of an undue burden is whether the cost of the accommodation, the benefits of the accommodation to the client, and the financial resources of the provider are hindered by this request. So that, of course, is going to be different for a large organization versus a tiny organization. So it's just good to keep in mind, but it's not up to us to decide whether it's a reasonable request. It's more if we're able to fulfill that request based off of the resources that we have. But do keep in mind that most are reasonable and most do not cost your organization anything. Okay, so lastly, we are going to talk about non-discrimination before jumping into service animals and assistance animals. So in terms of non-discrimination, we cannot deny services based on disability, appearance, or behavior, as we discussed in a lot of the previous laws. And do keep in mind that somebody who has medical needs is very different than a person with a disability. So some people with a disability may have medical needs as well, but they may also not have medical needs. And that's just good to keep in mind. So, you know, for example, if somebody had a medical incident like a stroke, but they are now medically stable, they may need a reasonable accommodation to have a bottom bunk or a chair in the shower. That person could easily receive those accommodations versus a person who had a stroke and maybe requires full physical support to get in and out of bed and needs somebody there all the time for safety and balance in the shower, even while sitting. That person has medical needs. So it's just to show you the difference between somebody who has a disability, who may have a need for a reasonable accommodation versus somebody who has a medical need. So in the first scenario, that person would be eligible for housing and you cannot discriminate against them due to their disability. Okay. Now we are going to talk about service and assistance animals. And to start off, we're going to specifically talk about service animals, which are outlined under the ADA as a right of an individual with a disability. So service animals are defined as dogs that are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. So those two pieces are really important. They do have to be trained to do a specific task or work and for a person with a disability. They are not pets, they are working animals. And if it's not obvious why there is a dog that is a service animal, the Department of Justice outlines 2 questions that we're allowed to ask the individual. The first is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? So that is a yes or no question. And the second is, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? So we can't ask what that disability is. We can't ask further questions or have them show us that task. Only those 2 questions can be asked to determine the service animal. And we're going to go a little bit more into service animals in a few slides, but first I want to talk about assistance animals. So service animals are assistance animals, but assistance animals also encompass emotional support animals or other support animals to provide assistance for therapeutic support to individuals with disabilities. And the difference here is that service animals are allowed into all public facilities and into housing, and assistance animals are outlined under the Fair Housing Act as being allowed into housing even when there's a no pet policy. So on the next slide here, I'm going to outline really specifically the differences because I do know that it can be a little bit confusing. So service animals, those are under the ADA. So that applies to all services, including housing, and the Assistance Animal Act is housing, which is going to include service animals as part of that too, but it's additionally other types of animals. So in the case of service animals, it can only be dogs or in a very, very rare scenario, miniature horses. But that very rarely ever happens, but that is what the law supports. Versus an assistance animal can be other varieties of animals like a dog, cat, a small bird, a rabbit, etc. But it cannot be a reptile other than a turtle. So if somebody has a different animal, you know, maybe they have an iguana or something, that would not be allowed into housing facilities. There are some scenarios where a unique animal may be required, and you can require additional documentation for that. For example, maybe a task that a dog is not able to do, or maybe there's an allergy. But other than that, you can't have other animals. So in the case of a service animal, you can only ask those 2 questions I outlined earlier. Is the dog a service animal required because of disability, and what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? But there is no documentation required. So you can't ask for documentation. You cannot ask for the dog to perform the task like we talked about, or the person's disability. In terms of an assistance animal, so assistance animals more, they're not trained for a specific task. It's more that they provide comfort in their existence. So you can ask for reasonable supporting information or documentation from a healthcare professional that demonstrates a disability if it's not obvious to you, asserts a connection between that disability and the need for the assistance animal and how that assistance animal alleviates the disability. You are not allowed to ask for medical records or more detailed information about the nature or severity of that disability. So there are quite a few differences and it's quite nuanced. So feel free to ask questions in the chat if you have any, and we will get to them in the end. But in terms of shelter responsibility related to assistance animal regulations, the shelter has to allow assistance animals with disabilities into the shelter and other facilities to receive services. So DFSS is currently developing a policy about assistance animals that will provide additional guidance for service providers. But do keep in mind that the owner also has a responsibility to make sure that that animal is leashed, caged, or in a tank unless it interferes with the task that they've been trained to do. So for example, some service animals are trained to go and retrieve medication and bring them back for an individual. And if they were leashed, they wouldn't be able to do that. So they do need to be leashed, caged, or in a tank. The owner also needs to maintain control of the animal, and what this could look like is they need to not be barking repeatedly unless provoked. So if you step on the service animal's paw, maybe they would bark, but they shouldn't really be barking unless provoked or alerting their human to something. There should be no display of aggression and no bathroom incidents inside or repeated bathroom incidents. So if there is a repeated pattern of an inability to control the service animal, that would be where you could exclude an animal from your shelter. The owner is also responsible for care of that animal. So if the animal is not under the control of the individual, you can exclude them from the shelter, but you still need to serve the individual. And so you can ask that they leave and come back without that animal. So in that case where you've asked them to leave and to come back without that animal, you need to document and document and document. So it's very, very important that you fill out exactly why you are excluding the assistance animal. So was it not caged or leashed and you've asked the owner to do so and they're refusing even though it doesn't interfere with their task? Was the animal not being cared for by the handler, or does the animal have an incident such as repeated barking or bathroom incidents or aggression or biting? And this helps protect you further from incidents so that if you do remove a service animal that is required because of a disability and then something happens, you have documented why you removed them that is allowable under law, such as one of these reasons. Okay. And lastly, we're going to talk about some things that you can do as an organization to support accessibility. So the first is going to be to audit your facility. So doing a self-audit on the next slide to make sure that your facilities and your programs are accessible and also to be aware of the accessibility features. The second is to train all your staff on disability rights and accommodations to make sure that there is no discrimination and that everybody is following laws as appropriate. Training is a good first step. Make sure to develop some clear procedures for requesting and providing accommodations and modifications, which fortunately DFSS helps you with and has provided that accommodation documentation for you all. Also, make sure to document your compliance and all efforts you make towards improvement. And lastly, make sure that you collaborate with disability organizations. So if you're not sure how to do something, it's always a good opportunity to reach out to one of the wonderful disability organizations we have here in Chicago. So on this next slide, we are a resource, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. If you need a referral for a community-based service, you can reach out to us by phone at 312-744-7050 or by email at access@cityofchicago.org. Here I've included some information about understanding a person's request to have an animal as a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. There's also the ADA National Network, which provides a lot of information about the ADA. Access Living is a local resource. Devices for the Disabled provides devices for individuals who may not be able to afford or buy those devices. The Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, where that can be very helpful is understanding different accommodations that may help with different disabilities or with different tasks. So it's not just related to jobs. You may also benefit from understanding how somebody's accommodation might be related to their disability or what accommodation may be appropriate for a different disability. And lastly, thresholds. Okay, and then in terms of filing a complaint or grievance, there are multiple levels that you can file these with. So in terms of the City of Chicago for ADA and Rehabilitation Act grievances, there's a procedure outlined on our website. For the Chicago Commission of Human Relations, like we talked about earlier, you can file a discrimination complaint on their website. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, you can report a housing discrimination through the website listed here. And on the next slide, there are a few state of Illinois grievance procedures, including the Illinois Attorney General Office, where you can file a disability rights complaint, or the Illinois Department of Human Rights, where you can fill out an investigation form. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Crispina to wrap it up with questions.
Thank you, Claire. So with that, I just wanted to go ahead and point out that you can reach out to the mayor's office for people with disabilities with questions on specific client cases, including for strategies and modifications or resources. And you can reach out to Christina, and her address is listed here on this slide. For reporting specific questions, program requirements, you can reach out to me, and my email is listed on this slide. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions. So please feel free to raise your virtual hand so we can call on you to ask a question.
And perhaps we can start with the questions that came in.
Oh yes, the chat.
In the chat, I can take the first one, which is the form, Crispina, that you walked through only required for accommodation requests? So yes, so we will send out a copy of this form. Basically, it's titled "Request for Reasonable Accommodation Form." We only need it when a client has requested an accommodation, and your agency has recorded a response to that request for accommodation. But tell me if there's another part of that question that I'm missing.
Oh, hi, this is Kim. I was asking if there was a difference between with the form that if someone's asking for an accommodation, like a change to a program versus a modification, which is a change to like a structure. Like, is it all wrapped into one? Doesn't matter that's the form you would use?
That's a great question. So technically, yeah, so we're only requesting the form for a reasonable accommodation, but Claire, do you want to go back to the modification versus accommodation slide to clarify that for us?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
The reasonable accommodation form to inform everyone about the request that was made and like the outcome of it. Is reasonable accommodations and modifications, that's all looped into one. That's the form you would use if somebody was requesting a change, on either side, that we would use that form.
DFSS is, I'm going to ask you, is that how you would prefer that they do their reporting?
Got it. Okay, we will take that question and convene, make sure we have the right response to that, and we'll share out a response in writing.
Right.
Thank you for that question.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, and then I see there's a bunch of questions here on service animals, assistance animals. So maybe if we can go back to that side. Clara and Christina, the first question for you here is for service dogs, does the dog have some form? Do we need to ask for written proof of training, or can we sort of accept the handlers verbalizing it as proof?
You accept the handler's verbalization as proof. You cannot ask for a proof, actually. So there is no documentation that you are allowed to ask for. And that actually goes into one of the other questions related to vaccinations. You cannot ask for proof of vaccinations, though they do need to be compliant with local laws of vaccination. So we can look more into that. But basically, like proof of rabies vaccination, for example, could be under local laws. So we may need to look a little bit more specifically into that, but you can't ask for proof of vaccination. But they do need to be vaccinated under law. How does a program balance the requirement to allow an assistance animal with the needs of another resident who might have a severe allergy to that animal? And that is a question that we get very often. Allergies are not grounds to deny a service animal, and so rather you would mitigate those circumstances as much as possible. So it may be that you have to provide a different sleeping location for those who have a service animal versus those who are not, or who have an allergy, or providing masks or air filtration systems. So it's not grounds to deny a service animal. Someone also asked a question in the chat that Christina, you may know of a resource or maybe not. They have a question regarding blind clients. There seems to be no shelters for them. They contacted the Lighthouse of the Blind, who confirmed there are no emergency shelters for the blind. And someone says, I don't know about shelters specifically for blind folks, but wouldn't it be discriminatory for any shelter to deny someone based on blindness? And that would be correct. So I think an individual who's blind or has low vision would be able to use any emergency shelter, not just specifically for them. The Lighthouse may be able to provide other resources. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just piggyback on that to say, yes, we do not have any city-funded shelters that are specifically dedicated to folks who are blind. But as Claire said, we would expect that any shelters under the regulations we've covered today would sort of make accommodations to serve folks who are blind. And yeah, Chicago Lighthouse is a great resource to connect folks to if you do have a client who is blind. A good housekeeping question here of when will the recording be made available? So we will share out a recording and the slides following this training. We've had 2 trainings. This is the second. So hopefully soon. I guess I won't commit to a date just to make sure we have everything in order to also then send out our responses to some of the questions that we received on both of these trainings. Great. So as folks have more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or go ahead and come off mute. I'll give us maybe another minute here, just in case folks are typing. Okay, well, thank you so much, Claire, Christina, Crispina, for the training today. Much appreciated. Thanks everyone for joining and caring to learn about how we can best serve folks who need your services. So again, we'll share out resources following this training, and that will include, again, the contact information for questions moving forward. But thank you all and have a great afternoon.